Now, barely a day before the NRM government marks 29 years in power, the question of the rule of law and constitutionalism remains a cornerstone of democracy, peace and development. But one question still lingers. Are the values of this important edifice of good governance beginning to get eroded? To discuss this is Makerere University Law Don, Dr. Businje Kabumba. Good evening, Dr. Kabumba.
Good evening, Rukh-Shana.
Happy New Year. I haven't seen you since the year started.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you too.
Thank you. We'll get right into the discussion. Professor Oloka Onyango writes, in regard to the 1995 Constitution about expunging the ghost of ex parte Matovu. But with incidents such as the Black Mamba High Court raid by a paramilitary group, isn't Matovu's ghost still looming large? Yeah.
What Professor Oloka Onyango was referring to was a case decided in 1966 that basically validated Obote's takeover of government and the passage of the Pigeonhole Constitution and the 67 one. And so by the ghost of Matovu, he refers to the tendency of the judiciary to rubber stamp patently illegal actions of the executive. And therefore that has left us a legacy of a weak, emasculated judiciary, and really not just the judiciary but other arms of government relative to the executive and especially an imperial presidency. Now, in terms of whether that ghost has been expunged, I think it has not and it could not, precisely because it assumes that we had a democracy to speak of. The NRM came to power through the force of the gun. So they were not elected into power. That's not necessarily an indictment of their history. Maybe it's a historical reality and may have been required at the time, but it's a fact of history that they not voted into power, so they came by force of arms. Now, the challenge that faced them, and I think continues to face the NRM now, is can you really give what you don't have? Can you give democracy if you're not democratic? If your birth was not democratic and your life, your continued life up to now is not democratic. There's a principle in law, nemo dat quod non habet. You cannot transfer or transmit better title than you have. You can't give what you don't have. And I think looking back, although democracy was point number one of the 10-point program, the reality has been what we may call a militarized democracy, where you have democracy in the shadow of the military. So you appear to have it, and you have it for as long as you remain on in the correct line, or in terms of certain correct politics. I think that has become apparent since 1986.
So at least there is an attempt to seem like they are, like we are getting democracy.
Yes.
Which we can live with under the circumstances.
Yes, and interestingly, it's pretty much what the British did between 1894 and 1962. And actually, President Museveni pointed that out. Every time he elaborated the 10-point program, he pointed out that, look, despite or different from what the Belgians did in Rwanda or what the French did elsewhere, the British did a sort of a disguised colonialism, a disguised power. And I think the NRM has learned from that and have continued to use divide and rule, or indirect rule, if you like, where the army is in charge, but then you have these, you allow the MPs to debate and pass resolutions, and you allow the judges to sit. Of course, that space is becoming narrower, and I think you're seeing now the face of the military becoming the fore. The judiciary, about 2 weeks ago, we protested as lawyers. We didn't show up for the lawyer, just to protest the emasculation of the judiciary, not having a head, a substantive head, and actually, and I think this is in the public domain, having an acting Chief Justice who really was a former Minister of Defense, I think has to be said. And so you have, in so many ways, subtle, some more obvious, a certain regression towards where we started from.
So based on what you've just said, what we can say is that the doctrine of separation of power is really only in theory, in the absence of a substantive Chief Justice, right? It has,
in Uganda's case, I think it has always been an illusion. The idea that we are now democratic, I think, has always been an illusion. Traced back from 62, even earlier. I think it's an illusion that continues. There's no separation of powers to speak of. I think if you ask any Ugandan who is really in charge, I think you'd get a singular answer. I think the elections just that we saw that brought back the LC5 elections just a few days ago, I think make the same point. For instance, the 10-point program I told about, one of the critical points was restoring social services. There you had the president telling electorate that, look, you have to vote a person who will support me, then I give you social services using my grant. I think it doesn't come more stark than that. The idea of a president saying, vote me or else. And you had actually 30%, not more than 30% voter turnout. I think that speaks to a realization by the people now of there's a movie called Hunger Games, of the voting, the democracy games that we have now.
Speaking of the issue of constitutionalism, one of the most contested issues about this was the lifting of the presidential term limits.
Yeah.
With hindsight, perhaps should the CA delegates have entrenched this provision, given our history dogged by political turmoil?
I think they should. I think they should have entrenched it, and that would have helped a little bit. And I've made this point before, that Article 260 perhaps should have included Article 1052 among those parts of the Constitution that you need both a two-thirds majority of Parliament but also a referendum. They didn't. And maybe in hindsight, yes, they should have done that. However, I don't think that alone, again in hindsight, would have solved the problem, because the same elections or referenda that are organized and forced through, in a sense, using extra-legal means, I think would have happened. Now, an interesting example is DRC, or just our neighbors, who have managed, I think, through the voice of the people, very well articulated and hard, to have their Senate decide otherwise. But I think in Uganda's case, we have what Justice Rukh-Shana described in a 1993 case in Tanzania, a population which is still largely plagued by poverty, ignorance, and disease, and which, very importantly, are apathetic. People, I think, have given up. They're resigned. I think everyone now says, let me do what I can do for myself and my children. Leave the man alone. And I think that's something...
That's a very short,
yes,
sighted way to live. But do we have any other option anyway? Precisely.
I think it's short-sighted. I think it's a question of self-preservation. And I think it's something you hear a lot from older people, especially. Like in my case, people saying, but Vito Mshija Tomureka. But why don't you leave the man alone? Is that the idea that let us do what we can do now? Let's survive it. And I think the sense that people survived other problematic times, and maybe a sense that if just wait long enough, this too shall pass.
It'll sort itself
Yes,
out.
this too shall pass. And I think that's maybe one of the major challenges we have as a population.
Yeah, former Rubaga North Member of Parliament, Betty Kamia, suggests that the 1995 Constitution ceded a lot of powers to the executive. What's your take on that?
I've always told my friend Betty that that's problematic because it falls in the same trap as those who see the Constitution as a means to an end. In effect, the Constitution is very important. But as important, if not more important than the Constitution, is the culture of constitutionalism, respect for the Constitution, both on the part of the leaders, but also on the part of the led. And the led must know what their rights are in the Constitution. For them to defend the Constitution and promote their rights, they must know what's inside there, then be willing to fight for it. Many times, I think, in the first place, Ugandans are not really aware of their rights, in a sense.
Who is supposed to make them aware of what is in the Constitution?
Article 4,
there are people who would know, but then you can't expect the masses to know what's in there.
And that's a very important question and a very loaded one, because Article 4 says the government should translate the Constitution into indigenous languages and then disseminate it widely. Of course, the reality is, first of all, a number of people still can't read or write. So even if you translated, that would be still a challenge. But I think also, more importantly, there's a whole challenge of autochthony, the extent to which our Constitution is organic, homegrown from the ethos of the people. What I think usually happens is a cut and paste job. South Africa is going through a constitutional reform process. We borrow from them and just package it. The Kenyans have borrowed a lot from ours. The Zimbabwe constitution follows a lot from Kenya and Uganda. So a lot of that, and if you look at the constitutions of the 1960s and even now, it's just really cut and paste. And maybe that also is a problem, because you then have a document that may be not quite, doesn't quite resonate with the people whom it's supposed to serve.
But I guess, personally, I do not necessarily think that the such and spin is a problem.
Yes.
I mean, it could be a problem, but perhaps we could have some tweaks here and there.
Yes, but it just becomes, and I think...
People just don't have the time to start thinking about these things. There's a lot, people are busy.
But they should, and because if you have a document you can respect, you can understand, then the chance of respecting it is higher. And I think maybe it's harder work to try to get there, try something organic. It's harder work, but I think if you have a durable document, it must be one that the people understand and they can respect.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us on Talk of the Nation.
Pleasure.
Dr. Abusinje Kabumba joining us on Talk of the Nation tonight to discuss whether the question of the values of the importance of edifice of good governance are beginning to get eroded. We will take another short break and return with the latest in NTV Weekend Sport.